We're recording to the cloud, and we're going to get started. So I want to welcome everybody to this session on remote work, and thank you for spending part of your Saturday morning or afternoon with us talking about these issues. My name is Lynn Rhinehart. I'm a senior fellow at the Economic Policy Institute, a think tank here in Washington, D.C. And before that was at the AFL-CIO for many years. And I'm delighted to moderate this panel on this very pertinent and timely topic. We all know that since the pandemic, a new feature of work has been an increased amount of remote work. Entire businesses and government agencies went remote literally overnight. And as we climb out of the pandemic, it seems clear that remote work is going to continue to be part of the landscape. Employees like working from home, mostly. Employers like saving on rent and other benefits of remote work. But this arrangement presents legal and practical issues for businesses, for workers, their unions, and for governments. Some of these are new issues, and some of these are variations on age-old issues, like what is a workday and how do you measure it? And then there's the question of who does and who doesn't work from home, and what are the gender and racial dimensions of that question. So that's what we're going to talk about in this session. And we have an extremely expert panel, and we're going to do all of this in the 58 minutes that we have left on the panel. So here's the format. I'm going to briefly introduce our panel. Their full bios are in the conference materials if you want to learn more about them. And then there's always Dr. Google. Each of our panelists is going to offer some comments, and then I'm going to ask them if they want to react to each other's comments. And then we're going to turn to questions from all of you who are here in this workshop. I am positive we're not going to get to all of your questions and comments, but we are going to do our best. So you can put your questions in the chat, and I really invite you to do so. I also invite you, if you have a comment or a resource on the topics that our speakers are addressing, please go ahead and put that in the chat as well, so that everybody can learn from what you know. So with that, by way of introduction, I'm going to introduce our panel, and at the outset express my great appreciation to the panelists for their participation here today, and particularly our panelists from across the pond who are giving us part of their Saturday night to participate in this discussion. So first is my colleague, Elise Gould. She is a senior economist at the Economic Policy Institute. Her areas of expertise are wages, poverty, jobs, healthcare, and economic mobility. In other words, everything. And for purposes of this session, remote work. Elise is also an active member of the nonprofit Professional Employees Union that represents the EPI staff. Elise has authored a new paper that's available in the materials looking at who is and isn't working remotely, and she's going to share the highlights of that paper today. We also have Janet Herold. Janet is the legal director of Justice Catalyst Law. For many years, until earlier this year, Janet was the regional solicitor of labor for the Western region of the U.S. Department of Labor, where she led a team in enforcing wage and hour, health and safety, and anti-discrimination and other laws. Yes, Janet is here to offer the enforcer's perspective on these issues. We have Christy Hoffman. She is General Secretary of UNI, Global Union, the Global Union Federation for Workers in Service Work, representing 20 million workers in 150 countries. Christy first joined UNI in 2004. She began as UNI's Deputy Secretary in 2010 and was elected General Secretary in 2018. It would take me the rest of the session to list Christy's various accomplishments, but suffice it to say she is a renowned and respected strategist, campaigner, and leader who has really strengthened workers' rights and protections in so many ways globally. We're delighted she's here today. And then finally, Tom Hayes is going to present an employer's perspective on these issues around remote work. Tom is the executive director of the Brussels European Employee Relations Group, that's BERG, an organization he founded in 2002, which now has over 90 major multinational companies in its membership. Tom is also the director of European Union Affairs of the HR Policy Association, which is an employer organization here in Washington, D.C. We greatly appreciate Tom's willingness to be here to share your thoughts and insights on these important issues. So that is our panel. So expert and so experienced. And with that, by way of introduction of this whole session, again, I would encourage everybody to put questions and comments in the chat. And I'm going to turn it over to Elise to take it away. Thanks, Elise. Elise, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
I was looking for, after I shared my screen, also professionally, I couldn't find the unmute button, but I believe you can hear me now. Yes.
We can hear you now. You sound great. Thanks.
Great. Okay. So there was a new jobs report yesterday. I can't really start without talking about anything about the labor market without at least mentioning that yesterday we had the latest jobs data for May of 2021. And I'm happy to say that I think it was a promising sign that the recovery is on track. The labor market added 559,000 jobs. So we can see that that is a nice increase after we had seen kind of a disappointing April report, but on track from what we've seen this year so far. The labor market is still down about 7.6 million jobs since February 2020. And you can see that huge drop off there. And that, we have to get those back. But when we think about what we really want to get back to, that pre-pandemic labor market, we have to make sure that we're keeping up with population growth. So that would mean we have a larger gap, or maybe even pre-recession job growth. So the first group in the economy that I am concerned about, which is not the subject of what we're talking about, are those people who have lost their jobs. So we have to think about them, and we're going to set them aside. Right now, we have a shortfall of about 8.5 to 10.5 million jobs, depending on how you measure it. So I would say that's the first group that's been hurt. The subject of what we're going to really talk about today is not the have and have-nots of the job loss, but the have and have-nots of who's able to telework in today's economy. And I know a lot of the focus is going to be on the teleworkers themselves. But I first want to sort of say that teleworking is far less common today than you might think. We surround ourselves with people that look like ourselves, oftentimes in terms of the professional class, levels of education, the people we work with, people in our neighborhoods. And it appears that so many people are teleworking, but actually today, the latest data shows that only 16.6% of the current workforce is teleworking because of the pandemic. So we did see, this graph shows you in the before times, we had a survey that we could sort of compare to the latest data that shows that 8.1% were teleworking for any reason, at least one day a week in the before time. So that's like data from 2017, 2018, and then it shot up. The data we have, the first data point we have in the pandemic was in May of 2020. And there you see that over a third of the workforce was teleworking. Again, that's due to two factors. One, a lot of the in-person workers left and lost their jobs. And so that affects the denominator. But then a lot of the people who were able to stay in the labor market and be able to continue getting a paycheck, disproportionately, there were a lot more people there that were able to then move to remote work and stay safely at home. That has come down pretty significantly over the last year. The last data point here is 18.3. As I mentioned, the data from yesterday, actually 16.6%. And who is able to telework, who is actively teleworking over the last year differs greatly. I'm going to first show you that by education over the last year, it shot up again from 3% to 12% for those with high school or less, much lower than other groups, but that has come down. And for those with a bachelor's degree or more, almost 60% of workers were teleworking at the height of the pandemic initially, and we've seen that come down. Still, about a third of those with a bachelor's degree or more are teleworking today. So now the rest of the data I'm going to show you looks at the entire pandemic period. So not just the latest data, but looking at 12 months of data to get some more texture about what is happening, what has happened in the pandemic and who was teleworking. So on average over the 12 months, about a quarter, 24.3% of the workforce was teleworking. Much more likely to be teleworking if you were what we call prime working age, between 25 and 54. And the youngest of workers were the least likely to be able to telework in the last year. Only about 1 in 9 of young workers. Not surprising, about a quarter of young workers are in leisure and hospitality. They also lost their jobs in greater numbers. So there's some correlation there. Women were teleworking in the last year more than men. By race and ethnicity and citizenship, we see pretty stark differences. White workers are more able to telework. Asian workers far more able to telework. That's Asian and Pacific Islander workers in the US, much more able to telework over the last year, and Black and Hispanic workers far less able to. US citizens more likely than non-US citizens. I already mentioned by education. Here you see over the year, over half of workers with an advanced degree, 51.6%. Are able to telework. That group looks a lot more like the group in this room, in this virtual room right now. So it's not surprising that that's who many of us would come in contact with, but far fewer numbers of people with lower levels of education were able to telework. And level of education does not fully explain the differences, let's say, between Black and Hispanic workers and Asian and white workers in their ability to telework. Here, I'm showing you the rates of teleworking because of the pandemic over the last year, again, the full year data here, by 3 different levels of education: high school educated, college educated, and advanced degree. And you can see that among high school and college educated, Black and Hispanic workers are still less likely to be able to telework. So like so many other things, the inequalities, the disparities in our economy, gaps in wages, gaps in wealth, they are not solved by more education. It does appear that once you get an advanced degree, that is somewhat insulating. So you can more likely to be able to work from the safety of your own home and not have to go out and work in person. But college does not close those kinds of gaps. What else we know about teleworking is that the kind of job situation you have matters as well. So if you're an hourly worker, you're far less likely to be able to telework than if you're a non-hourly or a salaried worker. If you work in the public sector, you have a lot more opportunities to telework than if you don't. So in the private sector, you only about a fifth to a quarter of workers are teleworking over the last year versus more than a third of public sector workers. If you're full-time, you're more likely to be able to telework than if you're part-time. And obviously there are huge differences by occupation. Workers in some occupations are far more likely to telework, but those occupations where you have to be in person, those essential workers, those who do hands-on manufacturing or face-to-face work with customers, they are far less likely. That's where the largest disparities are by occupation. So it gives a little bit of the lay of the land of what's happening. If you're interested in these slides, you can access them at goepi.org, teleworking, and get to them yourself, or find more information. As you heard, we did put out a paper this week. You can find that on our website.
Thank you, Elise, for that context. That's super important as background context to this discussion. Because you finished a minute early, I'm going to jump in and throw a curveball here and ask you one question before we move to Janet. And that is, as you put these statistics together and put the paper together, what surprised you, if anything? Or was it pretty much what you expected?
Well, because I've been looking at the data every month, it is to be expected. I was hoping that education was more universally insulating, so that some of those differences by race and ethnicity would go away. And so I was pretty disappointed to see that. I thought that maybe we would see, I was surprised that it came down so fast, the share of teleworking, I would say, in the economy. And then, really, whenever I talk to journalists or other colleagues, people are very surprised at, it's 16.6% now. I think, that number is just so much lower than I think people would have thought.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I think you're right. I think we all assume that everybody's teleworking all the time, and your context is really, really helpful in that regard. So, but the fact is that there's still a good chunk of people who are teleworking, and they are employees mostly, or not mostly, but many of them are employees while they're doing so, which presents some legal challenges and legal issues. Right, Janet? I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, Good morning from Los Angeles. So it's still morning here. So yeah, I'm going to talk about that legal and sort of compliance issues with a really broad brush. So the first thing I want to discuss is what I'm not going to discuss, which is that I think we've spent a lot of time when the pandemic first hit thinking that the most active space was really OSHA. And OSHA really moving forward and prospectively as to remote work specifically, there really isn't much to talk about there. There should have been a lot to talk about in the last administration when the pandemic first came down about OSHA. And I will forever think that was a tremendously missed opportunity for which employers and workers equally suffered. And the new administration is trying to do something about that. But that really relates to the pandemic and as opposed to remote work. With remote work specifically, OSHA, about my best recollection is about 2 decades ago, they actually issued a memo that suggested that they were going to regulate remote environments. And then they kind of just backtracked about that. And nobody has really heard about that again. So OSHA really isn't a thing, right? In terms of remote work. So the thing that is a thing is really when you're thinking about remote work from a compliance perspective or enforcement perspective, you're thinking about wage and hour and anti-discrimination. So first for wage and hour. So wage and hour is really tricky, right? For remote work. And the big issue here is that remote work throws a really big wrench in the continuous workday, right? So we've all, seen these on videos during the pandemic, right? The kids running through the back of the video site, right? Is that, the wage and hour is built on the idea that you sort of punch in the morning and you punch out in the evening. And in between those two dates, when you commuted into work and you commuted home, that you're working, right? And these were clear and bright lines. So remote work at least raises the possibility that that continuous workday is not happening, right, in the same way. And that really poses a lot, just a kind of a field of landmines, basically for employers and workers. So I'm going to talk about both because it's pretty dangerous terrain. So let's start with the employer perspective. So in the employer perspective, I think of this as sort of the difference between terrible ideas and unlawful ideas, both of which I think are, in play here for employers. So as a preliminary issue, there's no legal difference for a regular office environment or an industrial environment and a remote work environment. The wage and hour laws, there's no exemptions under the Fair Labor Standards Act or any state law that I can think of, and from a wage and hour perspective, that says, oh, well, if it's a remote work, we're going to do different rules. It's just not, there are no such exemptions. So there's the issue about remote work really raises this issue that's really tempting for employers and it's a very common misunderstanding about wage and hour laws, that you can pay based on productivity. As a general matter, except for piece rate, which I'll talk about in just a second, you really can't do that. If you don't like the productivity of your worker, or you're just dissatisfied with the work that a particular employee is doing, you cannot choose under the wage and hour laws to not pay them. You just can't. You can't discount pay them and you can't not pay them. You can choose to discipline them or get rid of them, but you can't not pay them. So, and that's a really common misunderstanding that arises in a lot of enforcement issues under wage and hour law. And when you bring in remote work, that really makes those temptations they really increase the temptation on that, because from the employer's perspective, you can't see your workforce. So let's begin with the terrible ideas. The terrible cost of ideas is increasing remote surveillance, everything from strategies in which employers are trying to count keyboard strokes or track your eye movements, right? Some of the same sort of technology that is used to keep our children actually attending lectures in their schools, right? When you use this for the employment context, it creates a lot of terrible outcomes. One, for the obvious morale issues, but also it really just heightens that low trust relationship that employers and workers can get into when the employers can't verify work. So that creates a lot of wage and hour issues. Generally, just low trust relationships do that. But then you move on to sort of the unlawful ideas. And a lot of those start with productivity-based pay. Under the wage and hour laws, there are productivity models of pay, and called piece rates. But as a general matter, from a compliance perspective, and I can speak to this for the literally hundreds of lawsuits I've brought in my career over this, many with the government, is that productivity-based pay rates are generally where people get into compliance issues from an employer perspective, because they're really hard to calculate the overtime rate. They're very complicated to enforce. And there's a very big misunderstanding about how those laws apply. So that's the first area in which people really get into a mess in moving away from an hourly rate as to a productivity-based rate. Second is more serious probably, which is the temptation in the current moment to just move straight past productivity-based rates to misclassification, kind of falsely treating somebody as a gig worker or as an independent contractor. And employers really need to remember that just because a worker is out of sight doesn't mean that the fundamental aspects of that employment relationship have changed. So just by moving a workforce to a remote location, or even by moving to a productivity-based pay rate, you don't make them an independent businessman. Therefore, all of the wage and hour laws still apply. So from the worker perspective, employee perspective, I think the dangers all lie in really not understanding that the remote work environment can be very, very exploitative. And I would point everyone to the history of industrial home workers in the garment industry sector as a cautionary tale. In many, not to go back too far in history, right, but in many jurisdictions across the US, not under federal law, but in most states, industrial homework by garment workers is actually prohibited. And the reason that was prohibited was because garment workers, many of whom worked at home, most of whom were female, we've spent almost 100 years, many decades, having these women work themselves into poverty and into death, early deaths, based on being paid piece rate basis, working out of their homes, and really exploitative practices. And so it's the same temptations here. So when we think about a population of employees now who have that loving feeling toward telework, want to, stay in their bunny slippers all day, that's really great. But if your work model, because of low trust or lack of surveillance, gets you to a place in which you're being paid based on how much you're working every single minute, industrial home workers for garment is, an area that I think employers and workers and unions should really think about. And the importance of that is really understanding that workers need to recognize that they have an interest in being very clear and transparent about their work hours and making sure that they're not interrupted. Have a clear set of work hours and work days. And to the extent there's no transparency on that, that's really going to come back and bite workers in the end. So just sort of understanding that. Finally, because Lynn has threatened us if we don't keep within our time limit, is on the anti-discrimination angle. When we think about remote work, there's, as Elise pointed out, there's different access issues as to who is eligible for telework. And as to the extent they break down on a protected class, that's still unlawful, right? There's no exemptions for that. So anytime there's a work benefit that breaks down on the basis of a protected class, that's going to raise an enforcement issue. Particularly that in the pandemic, we've particularly thought about those issues in relation to disability. But I think that the issue that has me most intrigued from an enforcement perspective is really the issues that relate to how remote work can actually drive discriminatory outcomes. And the area in which we think about, where I see this the most right now, is the gender situation, right? There's been a huge setback on gender pay equity. And to the extent women are more, women or different racial groups are being pushed into or kept in remote work and pay is being driven down, to the extent that drives those outcomes, I think we're going to see some really interesting enforcement cases, like many enforcement cases driven by pain and suffering. So I think that's sort of the next area of enforcement. But I think it'll be interesting to see how this works out, because so far, I think what we're seeing driven by the pandemic is all of the different racial, gender, disability-based, distinctions that we're seeing in our society, the problems are made worse by crisis. And the question is whether this is going to be a blip or a long-term issue. Right now, it doesn't look that promising. So that's it. Lynn, I think I came in within time.
You did. You did great, Janet. Thank you. And so you've identified a lot of challenges and issues. And me, the labor lawyer, what I think when I hear you talk is the solution is organize. Right, Christy? Your turn.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. Actually, I agree so much with the challenges that Janet identified. But anyway, so I'm from Uni Global Union, we're a global union federation across the service industries. And during the pandemic, about 30% of our members were working remotely. We also had about 30% essential workers and 30% who lost their jobs. So we had a taste of each. But primarily the ones working remotely were in finance and insurance, telecommunications, IT, to some extent, customer service through call centers. So we've had a pretty heavy engagement on this, sort of keeping up with who's doing what in which country, trying to collaborate to figure out, the best practices and so on. And I would say that some of the workers, especially in the banking industry and telecommunications, are very, very well represented by unions in Europe and Latin America. And they had already bargained over teleworking pre-pandemic. So they had a very strong foundation on which to build in this as we look forward to post-pandemic. And I'm going to come back to some of the agreements that they've reached. But then when you look at the US, where union representation, especially in banking, where it's just one little tiny bank, it's not hard to imagine that these workers they end up with the short end of the stick. And meaning, working longer hours, which is typical for all remote workers, possibly providing their own equipment, chairs, not sharing in the employer savings when they in fact close down big office buildings. And remember, we sort of over romanticize remote work, but when I'm talking to a bank worker in Brazil, they're not working with a nice home office. You're talking about people crushing in their computer at their kitchen table, or in the Philippines when they're doing call center works from, so the difference between having, the difference in situations is pretty dramatic. And the typical bank worker in the US earns, between $15 and $20 an hour. So what we see emerging post-pandemic is basically three scenarios. First is a hybrid, which we all dream of, in that it's ideal for many people. You work from home 2 days a week, or you have the right to work from home 2 days a week. And some countries are even legislating that all employers must allow flexibility in this regard. And so in that area, we just, banking union or insurance union just negotiated a very big national collective agreement in Spain with the insurance company Allianz, which gives people, they have the right to be at home 2 days a week. They can only have 2 separate locations that are validated for that purpose. So you can't just move all over. They have to be appropriate and suitable, and they have entitlements to an equipment package. So that's a good agreement, but that's going to be the minority, because most employers are going to choose to say you're 100% remote or not. If it's a question of economics, it's very hard to have people in both places, in the same week. And sometimes it's optional, sometimes not. This is, as I said, a big savings for the employers. We see a lot of this in banking, customer service, closing down bank branches. So that's a bigger problem that we have to deal with. And then the other thing that's on the horizon, which I think it touches a little bit more on some of the issues Janet was saying, is new jobs that are being advertised as permanently remote from the beginning. I think is the greatest risk to workers as being misclassified, because the job is sort of presented as a gig job right from the start. And a likely dilution of the employment relationship, in some way, whether it's the temporary or really driving down standards for those workers. So we've had regulation in about 16 countries in Europe, and then also some outside Europe, including Argentina, passed the first telework law. And what we see, and then you've got a lot of the legislation in Europe is developed through bargaining, through tripartite negotiation at the national level, then becoming regulation. And then it's, added on a specific company agreement to add the details for that particular country. The big themes are around economics. So question of combination of reimbursement from the employer for equipment, almost always it's laptop and chair and maybe a screen and so on, but that's almost always included in all the legislation. Could be tax breaks or compensation. That's not so controversial. I think the other big thing that we see a lot of is the question of who's responsible for safety, and it's clearly placed on the employer, and a lot employers have the option in many cases to ask for an inspection of your home to make sure that the site is suitable and safe. You have an ergonomic chair. We haven't seen a lot of inspections so far as I'm aware, but Tom may know otherwise. And then, of course, for those employed covered by union, the employment relationship is maintained, and there's no discriminatory conditions for those working in person or remote. And then lastly, for us, we have a big campaign around the right to disconnect, meaning that you're not expected to be available all the time. And so a lot of employers have reached agreements on you can be contacted during core hours. The core hours could be between 8 a.m. and 6, which is longer than the working day, but you could still be contacted. You could still get an email during that time. But the question of how you manage your hours, how you record your hours, that is an issue. And there's a big pressure for some flexibility in that. And so maybe some discontinuity, but you have to record hours. I think that's going to be an area where there's a lot of work in the future to figure out, like, how do you actually manage the new management tools without going so hard on surveillance. And that's where I want to say we've published our principles on remote work, and where I see the issues that are not getting addressed is surveillance. Number one, there's some agreements you can only have surveillance upon request, with consent. And if you have a union, the consent part is a fair, can be fair, but certainly for the vast numbers of non-union workers around the world, consent is not a safety, is not really protective. And beyond even the keyboard strokes, we're seeing cameras in homes, if for call center workers that they say they need a camera on all the time when they're working. So for security reasons, because they need to monitor that there's no one else looking at the screen while they're doing a call for Apple or something like that. But cameras are so intrusive. And so some of this has been challenged legally, but I think our position is if the security concerns rise to that level, it's not appropriate for remote work. You should be in a workplace if you have to have a camera on 24 or, the entire time you're working. But I think the other issues we're concerned about is the piecework phenomenon. Homework is not new. It is an old thing. We fought for a long time to get rid of it, as Janet said. And we see employers, especially in customer services and call centers, how many calls did you complete? This stuff is easy to monitor. So, in our work of, in the work of some work is harder to monitor, but some customer service work is very easy to monitor and measure. And I think that's where you see the danger of piecework. The gender impact, are these going to be dead-end jobs for women? Because if you're not in the office and having those personal relationships and building that, getting to know the boss and being around the decision makers, are you going to be consigned to, a dead-end job? I think this is really a big risk, and we need to have strategies around that problem. And such as it is, we are looking at that to negotiate those issues with some of the, more highly organized work sites. And lastly, the point that's not come up is Yet here is about union access to workers. And I think that, all of our labor laws are premised about on having a common work site, and we've overcome that in some industries like home care and so on. But even there, we had a common employer that brought us together from time to time. And so we are, interestingly, it's an enshrined right in Italy and Spain that unions do have access to workers, but implementing the digital access has not really been figured out. And I think unions are so worried, about making sure everyone has their entitlements and their rights. They're not putting much focus on digital access for recruitment and keeping in mind that everyone in Europe isn't an open shop. That's a constant thing that has to happen. And so, it's something we have to think about as unions. And one union in Germany recently negotiated a really explicit policy on that, giving them certain, digital bulletin boards and digital video conference rights and so on. But I think we have to do better work in Europe on that. I know Clean Slate in the US published some really good suggestions on access for remote workers. So, it's the same story. I'm almost done, but the workers with representation and bargaining are going to be protected through this transformation. And, we all want that ideal model where we can work from home a little bit if we want to, but we're not forced to be, segregated. But, the ones who are protected, they have a chance to come out of this with, I think, a better option, but others are really left to fend for themselves. And there are some big risks. We are looking at further fissuring of work if we don't get this right. I think that for me, and the inability to organize, the lack of collective identity, those are some things we have to get our heads around. And we want work to be more flexible for those who have the type of job that can afford that, but we really have to put the guardrails in place so to protect some of the bad things. So I'll stop there. I don't know if I made it in 8 minutes or not, but
you were close, and that was so interesting. Christy, I'm wondering if sometime during this session you'd be able to put up in the chat the bargaining guide that you sent us, and that's in the materials for the conference, because it's really interesting and helpful. So that would be great. Okay, Tom. So what are employers doing about all of this? Tell us. Uh-oh, we can't hear Tom, or I can't hear Tom.
Okay, is that better? Sorry. Yeah.
That's way better. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah.
Okay.
First of all, let me make it clear, I'm not any sort of employer spokesman. I'm a consultant who works with some of the biggest multinationals in the world. So I sort of know what they're thinking. And they know what I'm thinking, which is not necessarily the same thing. I think the first point to be made is that with great crisis comes great change. When we look back over the 20th century, we see how much changed as a result of, say, for instance, World War I, or for instance, how much changed as a result of World War II. And I think when we look at COVID and the way it has impacted working patterns, we are in the middle of a great change. And I'm not sure that employers and the ones I work with have fully got their heads around what all of this is going to mean in the long term. Most of those I talk to, we're looking at hybrid patterns of work, a couple of days a week at home, coming into the office. But I'm not sure that people are going to be working on fixed patterns. It's not going to be, well, you got to come into the office on Monday and Friday, and you can work at home Tuesday and Wednesday. I think it's going to be more flexible than that. And I think it's going to be dictated by what the job needs and what needs to be done. And that can vary from week to week and from month to month. But what I think we're going to see is a mix of working from, and I prefer the European phrase of telework rather than working from home, because quite frankly, as I think Christy said or somebody else said, not everybody can work from home. I'm lucky. I can work from home. My kids are grown up and gone. We've plenty of space. But I have a friend who lives in a 40 square meter apartment in Barcelona. Luckily it's just himself and his partner. They've no kids. I don't think they've got a dog or a budgie or a parrot. But if you do, how do you work from space like that? So the phrase I prefer is remote working or teletravail. What we're going to see, I think we're going to see is that what I call the distributed organization, where we're not going to all be in the same big office block downtown 5 days a week, 9 to 5, getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning, organizing the kids, organizing the dog, and so on. I think we're going to see a flexible approach, and I think employers are thinking in that sort of way, that the work will dictate what's required rather than any sort of fixed ideas or fixed patterns. For instance, one employer, one senior manager in a well-known company, which I can't mention, but does have a very well-known search engine, said to me that, look, I've got people who like to work from 10 o'clock at night to 2 o'clock in the morning because it suits them. Right? Am I supposed to tell them that they can't do that? Right? So I think employers are grappling with these issues just as much as everybody else. I'm European, so when you work in Europe, you've got to be conscious of the framework of laws within which we work in Europe. So, for example, health and safety. And Christy has just touched on this a few moments ago. You take a company, let's say, let me pick one out of the air. Yeah, the French insurance company AXA. Big, huge office building in La Défense in Paris. How many thousand employees there, right? That's one office building where you have health and safety and you can manage it. What happens when you send 20,000 people into 20,000 workplaces? And even if only 20% of the workforce is working remotely, that's a couple of million workplaces. Well, how do we make sure as employers that those workplaces are compliant? And what happens, I've often put it in discussions with my colleagues. What happens if I'm sitting at the computer like this, I decide to get up and make myself a cup of coffee and trip over the dog, right? Because the dog has a right to be here. It's his house as much as mine. Is that an industrial accident? We got to think about stuff like that as employers going forward, because if we don't think about them, we'll be confronted with them. Yeah. And, what about, again, people have touched on this and, this whole question of surveillance. That's an extremely difficult issue when you think in European terms with the general data protection regulation, privacy, issues around that. How do we deal with that? My own view is that over the last year, and when I have discussions with employers, the view we take, the way I express it to them is, look, guys, over the last year, this was an emergency. And in an emergency, you do what you have to do. Right? And quite frankly, nobody paid much attention to whether they were compliant with health and safety laws, whether they were compliant with data protection laws, whether they were compliant with working time laws. Over the past year, since about February of last year, March of last year, everybody was just trying to do the best they could in the most difficult of circumstances. But we're coming out of that. Europe is getting vaccinated at a pretty rapid rate. Travel regulations and a return to a degree of normality is now very much on the horizon. The laws can no longer be ignored, and they were ignored by both employers and employees. Let's be clear about that. People did what they had to do, as you do in an emergency. But now we have to go to think about the type of issues that Christy has raised, and they're not going to be resolved that easily. Right? I think a lot of employers, and there's a lot of, look, quite frankly, there's a lot of managers out there who just like to see their employees in front of them. I want to see what you're doing, right? Those days are over, right? Employees who can work remotely are not going to come back to the office 5 days a week, and employers who insist, like some of the big American banks, you'll be back in the office 5 days a week, whether you like it or not. They're going to find that they're going to lose talent. Because once you find that you can work in a more flexible way as an employee and be as productive, then you're not going to return to the days of 5 days a week wage slavery. Right? You don't often hear an employer's guy talk about wage slavery, but that's what the hell it is, right? So I think we all are faced with complex issues that we're only beginning to think about. The employers have as many issues to grapple with as indeed do the unions. I heard Christy talking about that the union model is built on the collectivism of the workplace where all of the employees are together and so on. But you'll hear managers saying, but our company culture is built on everybody getting together and going to the pub afterwards for a drink and all that sort of stuff. So these, as I see it, there's two sets of issues that have to be grappled with. There's the hard issues of law, health and safety, working time, data protection, data privacy. But there's also all of the soft issues that have to be grappled with as well. Like they say on those television programs, it's a phrase I really hate, but I use it. We're all on a journey here, right? That sounds like, come dance with me or one of these things, but that's what it is. And in Europe, that journey will be negotiated and traveled through dialogue between the social partners, at multiple levels. The United States, that's a whole different world. And I think that's about my 8 minutes, Lynn.
Great. Thank you, Tom, for those observations. And I actually want to, well, first of all, I promised I would offer each of you a chance to react to anything that each other said that you are inspired to react to. So I'll do that. But I have a couple of questions that each of your comments have raised for me. So I'm going to go to that next. But do any of the panelists want to throw anything else in at this point before we go to questions?
Look, I'm okay. I got to go last, so I was able to react to everybody anyway. So,
Okay.
It was interesting. I guess I'll just give a couple of comments because I was first. I think on the last things, everyone has said so many very useful ideas about what we need to think about and what's not protected and ways to protect people. One of the things I was thinking about when Tom was talking is that, you depend on the job. And so I have some concerns about what the job needs and doesn't need, and make sure that isn't distinguished across, make sure it is not randomly distinguished that perpetuates any kind of historic discrimination. So some people get allowances for something and some people don't. Why does that person get to work from home all the time and I don't? So make sure that that's all very clear. Anyway, I just was thinking about that in light of what we already know about historic discrimination in the labor market and how that plays out. I was also curious, sorry, I'm just going to ask another question myself that other people might have thoughts about. Sorry, Lynn. I was wondering about how the enforcement of standards around hiring practices or promotions or things like that, how that has played out and how people have thought about that, because I think it's also things that are fraught with concerns about discrimination as well. So I was curious about that.
Any of the panelists want to jump in on discrimination impacts of remote work or telework? We're getting away from working from home. Thank you, Tom. Anybody want to jump in on that?
So I would I would sort of say it's sort of still to be developed, at least on terms of discrimination. I think the area on hiring and promotion has been pretty lively for a while, but I don't think we know the impact of remote work. I think that's really the issue, right? I mean, I think there has been, particularly in the tech sector, I'm aware that particularly as to gender discrimination and certain types of race discrimination in tech, promotion has been a big issue because remote work has been more common there. And the feeling that you can't get promoted unless you're in the main part of the beehive. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that, and that could be driving some discriminatory outcomes. But I'm not aware of active litigation that I've seen on it. I've been involved in investigations on it. And that's why I think that there's no case law, because I was looking for it or trying to make it. And then just to use, because I came right after Elise, one thing I wanted to raise, Christy raised something really important that I forgot to mention. It's one important wage and hour aspect of remote work is reimbursements. It's a wage and hour sort of bedrock principle that employers have to bear the expenses of work, right? So if you're doing something for the employer, the tools are paid for by the employer, not the worker. And in remote work, I couldn't agree with Tom anymore, that in the last year, workers and employers alike were just surviving the pandemic. Everybody was ignoring everything and just going day to day. And many workers felt like having a job at all was better than no job, right? We've been on this road before, that part. But here, there's a lot of issues that I think in the US are not being paid, right? For example, the cost of internet, which is different, also has different racial impacts, I would say. Cost of internet varies across communities. There's food deserts, there's internet deserts. Costs of phones, and costs of rent, sort of all kinds of issues as to access, as opposed to just, we think, the cost of the computer. And when you think about those costs, they really can be quite high compared to your income. So that's a real issue moving forward. And I think that I've done no systemic study, but my sense is that in the US right now, employers aren't bearing those costs, and they should be. So I think the practices are quite uneven.
I think, can I say, I think that's an extremely legitimate issue. I think the question of who pays for what is going to be a subject of much discussion going forward. I would certainly say to employers that as a consultant, you have to accept the fact that employees are accruing costs, extra heating, whatever it might be, and so on. Now, bargaining over how much, that's the name of the game, right? But certainly from my point of view, any discussions I would have with employers, especially the better employers, they accept that there are costs involved. Now, how much cost is always going to be a matter of discussion. But I don't think you can sort of suddenly say, hey, do you know what? I'm selling this bloody big expensive building down in Fifth Avenue, and you're all going to work from home and pay for yourselves. So I just don't think that's going to work.
I have three questions. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to jump into your original question
Yes.
on the discrimination issue, but I do want to say in response to what Janet said is, what we don't have litigation. There's not so much discrimination litigation in Europe in general, but we do know from prior pre-COVID time that when remote work or telework is offered as an option, which it is in finance, it has been for years, it's predominantly women who accept that option. And we do also know that the evidence shows women are not highly promoted in banks, and there's a lot of discussion around that. And there has been some litigation in the UK. So, I don't know if it's a causal relationship or not, but it does make common sense that if you're not at the work site and the vast majority of people are, and let's say if it's 10% or 20% who are not around, it's out of sight, out of mind, and it's just not a career path. I think there will be proven to be a link at some point in some, I don't think it's long for that. It will have to wait very long for that. In terms of the costs, as I said, all the legislation in Europe requires payment of costs, but it's really divided differently. Equipment is one thing, but then there's the cost of internet, which only some, so like some amount for just overhead expenses. And rent is one line that hasn't been crossed, which the only place where I live in Switzerland, there's been a law in place since like 1985 or something, which says if you force people to work from home, you have to pay a proportionate share of their rent. But so far that hasn't been triggered, but I do think that's the big piece. And even internet, we have examples of workers in the Philippines who were required to work from home for the call center and then buy the internet back from that same service from the call center. So because that's a real issue in developing countries is access to internet. And then you only get paid for those hours you can work if there's a blackout. So there's a lot more complicated situations where you don't have good internet, but I don't see very many examples of places where employers have to pay for that cost. And I've seen some arguing, well, you don't have to pay to travel, so you should take some costs on yourself. In fact, in Germany, there was a proposal workers who are teleworking should pay higher taxes to compensate for the fact that they're not traveling. It didn't go anywhere, but it was actually a real proposal. Anyway.
That's fascinating. I would have thought it'd be the other way, a tax break because you're not, putting all of this into the environment and so forth. But
yeah,
anyhow.
I mean, it's just the question is, there's a lot. We've done the math. We've got some calculations out there. The amount that employers are saving by reducing their own overhead, by closing down office buildings. It's not just the real estate, it's the cost of running the buildings and everything associated with that. It's really quite high. And I don't see anybody actually taking a piece back of that and getting a raise because they're working. There's no sharing of that.
Actually, Lynn, there was a proposal at one stage in the UK that people working remotely should be taxed, and the tax should be used to compensate all those businesses that sold coffee and dry cleaning and so on. Right now, that didn't go anywhere either. But look, when you're in a period of change, you're always going to get a bunch of nonsense proposals, right? That won't go anywhere. And we face real issues. We face real issues, both as workers and as workers' representatives, as Christy is, and as employers, about how do we manage all of these things now that we're looking at remote work as a long-term part of the employment model. And it's going to take a little bit of time for them to be worked out and for them to be settled down. And, as I said, you're always going to get some nonsense ideas, but I think over the next year or two, we're going to see emerging some sort of template, some sort of models around a lot of this.
Okay, well, that's interesting. I have a question specifically for you, Tom, following up on that. Then I have a question out of the chat specifically for Christy, and then we'll see where we are. But specifically for you, Tom, Christy talked about how this whole remote work phenomenon, there's concern that it increases the incentive for employers to change jobs into employment, into independent contractor relationships from employment relationships. And I was wondering if you could comment on that from your perspective, talking to employers. Do you think that there's that temptation? How tempting is that temptation for employers?
Well, there's no question whatsoever that the temptation is there. And when you consider some of the issues that employers are faced with, like, for instance, how do you make sure that a remote work site complies with health and safety laws, complies with data protection laws, complies with working time laws? There's of course there's a great temptation to say, well, if they were all independent contractors, if we Uberized them all, then we would no longer have these issues. So of course that temptation is there. But the other side of the coin is that organizations don't necessarily work on that basis. They need people who are committed, and commitment is a two-way street. If the organization isn't committed to you, then you're not necessarily going to be committed to the organization. So companies look at these things it's not just a cost consideration. Of course there's a cost consideration, but I would put it this way: sometimes the cost considerations are more than outweighed by the cultural considerations. And yeah, of course there's a temptation there. There's always a temptation there. And every accountant and financial controller is always more than tempted by than the human resource people. But you've got to balance the cost with the cultural considerations. And in my own view, the better companies, and most companies are the better companies. Of course, there are the rogues and the cowboys, but most of the better companies are not going to yield to that temptation.
Well, from your lips, as they say. Let's hope that's the case. Christy, we have probably 90 seconds left. So in that time, can you please say how on earth we organize and have unions when the workforce is split among a central workplace and a whole bunch of remote work locations? you talked about this a little bit in terms of digital access, but any other insights or comments on how we face those challenges in trying to organize and have unions in this new remote
Well,
world?
we've been organizing it all through the pandemic using digital tools, and quite a bit you can do through contacting workers and so on, all up until, without much face-to-face contact. Now, I think you need some face-to-face, but we have had campaigns where workers have joined unions without any face-to-face, and you've seen a lot of that even in the US with some of the digital organizing that's happening. But really, I think in terms of remote work, we need to embed. So when workers are hired, that they do whatever their induction process involves contact with the union. That's a classic thing that we do in open shop situations in other countries now. If it's not face-to-face, it can be at least a Zoom call. We need to be part of their video conferences where they're inducting workers, even if even remote workers have to be treated as new hires and go through a process and meet and get to know what matters and so on. There's just getting the data, the information to be able to reach out to workers. There's good old fashioned house calling like we've done with many, many campaigns, but the starting point is getting that access to the intranet process of the employer so that, we are part of that ecosystem, and there's all kinds of ways in which you can meet workers, whether it's face-to-face at their home or, bringing them together. There will still be staff meetings, for example. You could still collectively bring staff together or the remote staff, as long as the union is affirmatively included as far as that access agreement goes. Now, you have other countries where access is a right of unions, whether or not they're recognized. There is, and we don't have that in the US. So there's special challenges in the US for access. But I think that's something we have to think about. And when we think about, changing the labor law, it's, we had problem getting into private property always in terms of organizing in the US, and we've gotten around that a little bit, even using digital tools. But I don't think it's insurmountable, but it needs to be, we have to be proactive about it. And again, even the European unions who have a right to access are trying to figure out how do we operationalize this in a digital environment where we're talking about people being remote and having a hard time with it. I'm not, this is like, oh, we just signed people up because so-and-so asked them on the job, and that doesn't happen anymore. So you have to be more thoughtful, more conscientious, and negotiate the explicit rights and it's an explicit process.
Yeah,
so that was
yeah.
more than 90 seconds.
No, that was great. And you all have really said so much about how some of the considerations as we all feel our way forward in this brave new world that we're living. We are over time, so I just want to thank you all for taking the time to participate, and thank all of the attendees for coming to this workshop. Will you join me in giving our panelists a remote hand, a Zoom hand, right? And thank you, and enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Lynn.
Bye.
Bye.
Get the next one.
Bye, guys.